dynamically together. How close are we to nuclear war? I think the Doomsday Clock is a good measure of our proximity to disaster. You know, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists in 1947 presented this clock to symbolize for the public how close the world is to a nuclear Armageddon. And when the clock was unveiled in 1947, the atomic scientists put the minute hand at 7 minutes from midnight. The message was, we're in great danger. We've entered a new world, the world of atomic weapons, and we are close to disaster. Well, we know that the history since 1947 has brought us to the brink many times. It has also been the occasion at some periods for pulling back from the brink, finding nuclear arms agreements that made the world safer, reaching understanding between the nuclear superpowers
in progress.
that enabled us to pull back. But suffice it to say, we are now 90 seconds to midnight, according to the Doomsday Clock, the closest by far that we have ever been. In fact, when the Cold War, no, let me put it a different way, because the Cold War didn't end, but when the Soviet Union ended in December 1991, the bulletin put the clock at 17 minutes from midnight, which was the farthest ever from nuclear disaster. The message was the end of the Cold War, supposedly, the end of the Soviet Union, the end of the military standoff, the reunification of Germany, the peace that Mikhail Gorbachev was ushering in. All of this would take us away from the cliff. Now, every single US president, from the start of his administration till the end, has brought us closer to the cliff, brought us closer to doomsday. From 17 minutes from midnight in 1992, we are 90 seconds from midnight now. And we know that there are 3 raging conflicts, among many other conflicts in the world, but 3 raging conflicts, any one of which could spiral into a nuclear war. One, of course, is the war in Ukraine. The second is the war in the Middle East. And the third is the extreme tensions between China and the United States in East Asia, largely over Taiwan and the South China Sea. Well, each of these deserves a very careful analysis. Let me just say that I've been able to see close up all 3 of these theaters of conflict during my 44 years of work as an economist. I'm not a nuclear strategist or a general or part of the military-industrial complex or an international relations specialist, but I deal with heads of government all the time, all over the world. I've dealt with well over 100 governments at the highest level, so I've watched these events close up. I was an economic advisor to Mikhail Gorbachev. I was an economic advisor to Boris Yeltsin. I was an economic advisor to Leonid Kuchma of Ukraine. So I was there right at the beginning when supposedly the Cold War was over. I watched and saw a lot. And I've been around these issues intensively for decades. And while what I'm saying is not accepted by the mass media, my strong message to you is that US provocations repeatedly are at the core of all of these conflicts. These are not conflicts caused by an unprovoked war by Vladimir Putin, despite that canard or that myth being repeated endlessly. This is not a war in the Middle East caused by the intransigent Arab opposition to Israel, no one to talk to, failure of the Oslo process because of Yasser Arafat, and a lot of other propaganda. This is a war because Israel, with its almost complete control over US politics, insists on an apartheid state that rules over millions of Palestinians and denies at every single moment the idea of negotiating with the Palestinians or with the Arab states, all of which say repeatedly, including again last week in Riyadh, in the reiteration of the Arab Peace Initiative, that they want peace based on a two-state solution. Just to be clear, Israel, especially under Netanyahu, but generally, does not want a two-state solution. So we have war. And in China, the tensions with China are not because China is a communist state encroaching on its neighbors and militarizing the South China Sea and so on. China is militarizing the South China Sea because the United States is doing everything possible to surround China militarily in the Indian Ocean and in the South China Sea. And a week doesn't go by in which some publication talks about the choke points that the US holds on China's sea lanes and how the US aim is to keep China behind the first island chain and thereby ensure that China is weak and subject to American power. So my understanding of the last 30 years is actually, it took me a long time to understand it, is that the Cold War never ended from the US point of view. As soon as the Soviet Union went down, and I was literally in the Kremlin that day with Boris Yeltsin right across from me, telling me and my colleagues that the Soviet Union is over to our face at that moment. From that moment, the United States has been trying to bring down Russia as well, to surround Russia with NATO, to weaken Russia, maybe to divide Russia, maybe to cut it into little pieces, as Kaja Kallas, the new High Representative of Europe, disastrously says all the time. She's supposed to be a diplomat, not a warmonger, and not somebody to get us into World War III or nuclear Armageddon. But the talk is all about defeating Russia, dividing Russia, splitting Russia into little bits. And that is the American idea. It's crazy, it's dangerous, it's reckless. It deliberately ignores every one of Russia's red lines. It rejects honest negotiations, even it rejects any negotiations. Biden didn't talk to Putin one time since February 24th, 2022, when the special military operation started. Not once. And Scholz apparently spoke for the first time yesterday, but they didn't have the guts to speak until the election, and now with Trump, some kind of new sense that Europe must do something different from what it's been doing. Now, mind you, in addition to provocations by the neoconservatives, and in addition to the US waging war on Israel's behalf repeatedly, because when you look at the data, and it's shocking, by the way, and again, I don't have time to elaborate, but when you look closely, the US went to war with Iraq in 2003, not because of weapons of mass destruction, but because Netanyahu wanted to bring down Saddam Hussein, who was a supporter of Hamas. And then they had to concoct a story inside the Pentagon. How can you sell a war like that to the American people? So they got a PR guy, and I'm literally speaking the truth, they got a PR guy named Abram Scholz to do focus groups and to come up with the PR strategy. How are we going to sell this war? And they decided to sell it on the basis of weapons of mass destruction that, of course, didn't exist. But that was Netanyahu's war. And he's all over the record saying, yes, United States, you got to go to war with Iraq. And in 2011, the United States, Obama tasked the CIA to overthrow Assad in Syria. It's called Operation Timber Sycamore. Again, it was Netanyahu. It was the Israel list. You got to topple all these governments that support Hezbollah, that support Hamas. This is Netanyahu's strategy. We don't have to negotiate with anyone. We just have to topple Syria, Iraq, Libya, and the big prize, Iran. And all of Netanyahu's actions now are trying to lure the United States into what would be a completely disastrous war with Iran. In addition to all of that, the US walked out of several nuclear arms agreements. And this ratcheted up the tensions dramatically with Russia. The most consequential action was in 2002, when the US unilaterally abandoned the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. The US abandoned the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty in 2019. The US abandoned unilaterally the Open Skies Treaty. So the US decided a few years ago, Russia's too far behind technologically, Russia's too weak. Why should we be bound by these nuclear arms agreements when we can rush ahead and win some kind of nuclear dominance? Of course, it's idiotic. There is no such thing as nuclear dominance. There's only Armageddon. And when we're talking about a nuclear superpower like Russia, which has 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons and 6,000 overall nuclear weapons, all of this, everything I mentioned, the NATO enlargement, the overthrow of the Ukrainian government in 2014 with the US CIA playing a significant role in that, the arming of Ukraine, it's all unbelievably stupid and reckless. Now, a big puzzle is why Europe has gone along with all of this. And honestly, I can't figure it out because, yes, I know that Europe depends on the US nuclear umbrella, blah, 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 but we used to have leaders. We used to have Kohl or Schmidt or Willy Brandt for that matter, or Angela Merkel, who would say to the United States, no, that's not right. And we know that the European leaders, including the Norwegian government, was against expanding NATO to Ukraine in 2008 when the US pushed this absolutely reckless idea at the Bucharest NATO summit in 2008. And as everybody knows, what happened was the US said, let's make a timeline for Ukraine's membership in NATO. Merkel, Sarkozy, others said, no, it's too reckless, Norway being among them. And they settled for the US pushing for a statement in the final communique saying that Ukraine will become a NATO country, but without a map, so-called, without a plan for NATO membership. But that set us on the path to this war. And Europe just refuses to be honest about any of this. No European leader other than Viktor Orban and Robert Fico of Slovakia speak honestly. And I know privately, many of them agree with things I'm saying. Maybe not all of it, but they agree with a lot of it, and they don't say it publicly. And this is really Europe's terrible behavior right now. The lying, the prevarication, the hiding behind the US is awful. Now, with Trump coming in, the Ukraine war is likely to end soon, because Trump doesn't really care about NATO, and I don't think he cares at all about NATO enlargement, and he's told the voters repeatedly he doesn't want to spend more money on this. And I assume that Europe will be smart enough to not continue this disastrous course on its own, and it's impossible. Europe doesn't have anything like the weapons available or the finances available to support Ukraine for a moment anyway, without the United States. And even with the United States, none of it's working. For Russia, this is an existential issue. For the United States, it's a game. For Europe, I don't know what it is. It's a confusion. But in any event, Trump is going to end that. How it ends, whether it's extraordinarily messy or not, depends on the understanding and skills of the American side, which is never highly predictable, by the way. On the other issues, the Middle East and China, I don't see any clarity or optimism for what is coming. All of Washington is in a crazy, neurotic tizzy about China. It's all anti-China morning till night. Our newspapers are full of the coming war with China and so on. It's extraordinarily dangerous. It's almost all by people probably who have never been to China at all. China is not a threat to anybody. China could not attack and defeat the United States. The whole idea is completely absurd. China is not attacking any of its neighbors in the region for 2,000 years of statecraft. It doesn't do that. And it's not about to do it now for no reason and give up all of the reputational gains and knowing that it could only go very badly anyway. China is not a threat. Why Jens Stoltenberg repeatedly said China's a threat is because he was working for the United States, and shame that he said such nonsense, and shame that NATO, which is in my view, an unnecessary, but at least a North Atlantic treaty organization, has no business being engaged in East Asia. It's direct risk and provocation. So the Ukraine war is likely to rather quickly end. Whether war more generally ends, whether Trump is coherent, adding to instability or making peace, I don't know. But what I do know is that Europe needs a completely different approach. First, it needs honesty, and it needs space from the United States. And that's not only strategic autonomy, say in Macron's sense, because it's good for Europe to be strategically autonomous, but because the United States is a completely unreliable party to all of this. The United States has delusions of hegemony. The United States destabilized the nuclear arms agreement. The United States is the single barrier to a state of Palestine. Literally, it's one veto in the UN Security Council. The US is the only reason for the high tensions with China, because China's surrounded in Japan, in Korea, Australia, New Zealand, AUKUS, the Quad, the US Navy, by the US military. And the US is upping its arms shipments to Taiwan. So Europe needs a strategic understanding, not only because that's sensible, period, but because the United States has been wildly off course, and there's no guarantee that it's going to get back on course. Most of all, I would just like some sanity in Europe, some honesty. Putin is not a deranged Hitler of 1938. This war had reasons, you can track them in detail. The United States shouldn't be provoking at every step. Ukraine can and should be a neutral country, and it would be safe as a neutral country because no one would have any incentive to destabilize a neutral country. The neutrality would meet Russia's security interests, and it would meet the West's security interests. And while Norway's not part of the EU really lost its way by thinking that the EU and NATO are the same thing. They're different. First, NATO is a military alliance that I think has no particular purpose anymore. But second, the EU is an economic and social union, and we should keep the two distinct in the interest of peace. So let me thank you for just allowing me to make these few brief remarks. They may sound strange to some or unsupported, but believe me, this is years and years and years of direct engagement. I'm seeing and discussing these issues with world leaders just about every day, by the way, with the diplomats at the United Nations, where I've served 3 secretaries general as special advisor. So these are not just piping off or anti-Americanism. This is the destabilization that I've seen from the US side, and I really deeply dislike the secrecy of the US deep state, and I believe the CIA has been our most dangerous institution and our biggest failure since its founding in 1947. But these regime change operations and wars of choice absolutely need to end, and then we would have a chance of survival, and we could push the doomsday clock back from 90 seconds to midnight. Nikolai, back to you.
Thank you very much. I know that you are short of time, but can I ask a few questions to you?
Sure.
Okay. So you said that U.S. provocation is behind all these hot wars or conflicts. Do you think there's people in the leadership of U.S. that really wants to push for a nuclear war? That's one question.
Yeah.
And the other one, you mentioned that European leaders you talk to, they can agree with you, but they don't speak out. So why don't they?
Yeah, two very good questions. We have had leaders in the past in the military, for example, Curtis LeMay, who really believed in first strike nuclear war. I don't think that's the main, I don't even think that's the motivation or the belief. What I think is that American strategists became drunk on American power after 1991. And you could read, for example, in the global, the Grand Chessboard, written by Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1997, a good chapter that explains all of this. Now, he was on the wrong side, he reached the wrong conclusion, but the chapter explains if we proceed with NATO enlargement, Russia has no choice but to accede to American power. So the Americans are playing a game. They're playing a game of chicken. They believe that America has the dominant power, even the full spectrum, the dominance. They don't want nuclear war. They never thought it would come to that. They thought that Putin would never escalate the way he did, that if he did, American financial sanctions would tank the economy, that if that didn't work, the HIMARS and the attack of missiles would do it, that if that didn't work, the loss of lives in Russia would destabilize the regime. If that didn't work, someone like Prigozhin would come along and try to overthrow Putin. In other words, these people are fantasists. And they talk to each other and they play strategic games. So they're not aiming for nuclear war, they're aiming for winning a game. And it is viewed as a game because they don't even talk about the 600,000 Ukrainians dead as a result of their little game. And they'll wipe their hands of it probably under Trump, and we'll never hear about Ukraine again in the United States because there's no deep interest in any of this by the American people. So I think that it's not that they want nuclear war, it's that they thought that America is so powerful, it can get its way. Now they're waking up to reality. They thought Russia was, as they used to call it, a gas station with nuclear weapons. Not quite. They thought that China was a country of rice-growing villages. Not quite. They thought that Iran was a country of mullahs, not a country of hypersonic missiles. So they're having to recalibrate all of this. And I'm hoping that maybe Trump and Vance will bring in people that can recalibrate. That's the hope. No guarantee. 5 presidencies, no recalibration. But this is really the hope. When it comes to the European leaders, it's just the damnedest thing. It's so strange. I've had a conversation with, a head of state one day, and then the next day they say the opposite to what they said to me in private. I can't really explain it. One leader in Europe said to me that, they treat us like children in Washington. I was shocked by the statement, not because they treat the European leaders like children, but because first he would say it to me, and second, that they would let themselves be treated like children. Europe doesn't have to be treated like a child. It's ridiculous. So Europe has a lot more power, but it actually does require coherence of Germany, France, Italy at the core, because these are the big countries. Britain is hopeless, because Britain just kind of signed away all free will sometime around 1945 to the United States. And that was the goal, that was the plan. I think the British think that they're winning because really they control the American state. I don't know. But anyway, Britain is hopeless. Look at Starmer. First thing he does, first day, flies to Kiev. Next week, he flies to Washington to say that the US should strike deep missile strikes inside Russia. What a shame. It's a Labour Prime Minister, for God's sake. So I can't answer the question. And I can only tell you, when Tucker Carlson asked Putin that question, Putin said, I don't know. He asked him, why is Schultz so quiet? Why does Schultz stand there when the US blows up Nord Stream? And Putin said, I don't know. So it's pretty interesting.
Okay, I think we have 2 questions from the audience. Can we have that to Jeffrey?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Someone else?
Okay.
Wow.
So this is from Olav Thunander. He's one of the speakers later today.
Great.
Yeah.
Yes, I want to continue about the British question. And I listened to the former head of the Royal United Services Institute, Michael Clark, and he said that we had to use these Storm Shadow and similar missiles against Russia, and not just 20 or 30 or something like that, but several hundreds. This is the only way to change the situation on the ground. And the argument he had about the US and Biden was that he was too weak and he didn't want to have on his record to have started a large global war. But from the British point of view, this seemed to be less of a problem. How do you look at the US-British relationship in this thing?
I've come to the conclusion that the British are absolutely out of their minds. I was tricked for most of my 70 years because they speak English so beautifully. And they're absolutely out of their minds. They had too many centuries of dominance. They make no sense at all. And I've seen it time and again now. They're reckless. And this is MI6, this is the Foreign Office, this is the military, this is these think tanks, completely reckless. And I think it is just the reverie of empire, too long, too far. It's an interesting sign. It still hasn't gone away 80 years after the end of the British Empire. But that's my own interpretation of this. I think the US finally realized they're nuts, and they're not listening to them. But it is very, very shocking and really disappointing. But it is what I'm seeing all the time in recent years.
Thank you, Jeffrey. We have one more question here, and I think we've reached that 30 minutes.
Yeah, and by the way, I should say one thing about a fascinating book written in 1970 by a historian named Gleason called The Origins of British Russophobia, Harvard University Press. And in 1970, this historian tries to understand how is it that the British, who were allies of Russia in the war against Napoleon, became enemies of Russia within basically 25 years. And so the book traces every word, every step. And the answer is no reason. The Russophobia was not because of Russia's behavior. The Russophobia was Russia is large, and the British Empire wants to dominate, and a large country is a threat to British dominance, period. And so by 1840, the British hated Russia, not because anything that the Tsars had done, not because they had invaded India through the Khyber Pass, and on and on and on, but because of a Russophobia that was created, because Russia is so big that maybe Britain won't be the world hegemon. And this is the US approach also. The US hates big countries, and those are China and Russia right now, because they're an affront and a threat to hegemony.
Thank you. One more question over there.
You mentioned about this US hegemony, and I'm sure that they are trying to crush everybody. I mean, they're the top. Like they say, the sun has sex for the British Empire. And now we must say, I hope it's not this atomic bomb which erases the American hegemony. But my question is that this behavior of politicians and these kind of lies and all those things have been going on for several years. But there must be a bigger picture to it. We have these economic institutions. Today you don't know who is who, everybody is merging with one another, and you don't know which corporation is which. And like it's good that you mentioned about this Napoleon War and Rothschilds, how they were sort of instigation to deciding who wins the war and things like that. So how can we all the time talk about this too, you know, the economic hegemony, these multinational corporations or the empire, which really exists, which is controlling the whole world today?
Yeah, it's fascinating to try to unpeel the onion to understand what is really the motive force. Part of it is the institutional mechanism of the deep state, actually, which is that it really started in 1945. World War II ended. As it was ending, the United States decided within weeks of the capitulation of Germany that the Soviet Union was the new enemy. Again, it wasn't because of what Stalin did, it was because they decided our next target is the Soviet Union, and actually internal US documents starting in 1945, we're going to have a war with the Soviet Union by 1952. This was basically the internal view. The CIA is a deep institutional piece of this because it's completely unaccountable, it's secret, no matter how many times it fails, which is most of the time, it is not accountable. And so this is another reason why a policy can continue for a long time. The idea of NATO expansion goes back to 1992, and really a policy decision by Bill Clinton of 1994. And it was spelled out by Brzezinski in 1997 in his book and in another influential article. But the point is, these are long, deep trained policies. They don't get decided year by year. They're basic strategies, and they don't change except across generations. That's one part. Second, who do they represent? Well, partly themselves, partly the military-industrial complex, partly big money. Definitely, big money more generally is a part of the story. America wants control over markets everywhere. And so it wants to make sure that the resources flow in the right way, the oil flows in the right way, the pipelines go to the right places. This is an ancient story, but it's also part of the story. And I think that it's true that both economic interests, deep state, grandeur, stupidity, ignorance, arrogance, all play a mix in this. But the important point has been continuity of policy. Biden didn't invent anything. He continued policies that had been in train for 30 years. He was completely incompetent. But anyway, he continued those policies. So I think it's a mix of inertia, unaccountability, bravado, military-industrial complex, narrow financial interests, and overall financial interests.
Thank you. Can we have the last question, Jeffrey? Then
I should run, so if it's quick.
very quick.
Well, good afternoon to you and other people in Armenia. I hope the situation is calm right now. But there's political mystery to me. I'm studying and reading politics all my life instead of 75 years old. And that is for you, conservatives. Ideology in the United States of America seemed to rise around 1990. It's still going on. They have representatives who are still in both parties. So I give Tuska my best regards. Thank you.
Yep. So, yes, this is ideology is part of the story. My colleagues at university and the think tanks, they're all supported by military firms. They're supported by the U.S. government grants. So there's a lot that goes into supporting the narrative. The newspapers, such as they are, and it's unbelievable how bad the New York Times is. It's a lie a minute. I can't even read the paper at all. Not for facts. I only read it to try to understand once in a while what other people are looking at. Otherwise, I find it completely awful and undigestible. So the ideological part of this is real and continues. My colleagues at Columbia University are Hillary Clinton and Victoria Nuland. You know, I'm surrounded by neocons. They're a big part of this story. So this is, I'm hoping it would be incredible. It's not completely impossible. It's far from assured that Trump will change something of this. There's a very interesting interview of Vladimir Putin in Figaro in 2017, where he says, he said by that point that he had dealt with 3 US presidents, and he said, they come into office with ideas, then men in dark suits and blue ties come to tell them how the world really is, and you never hear of those ideas again. And so this is a pretty experienced, hard-nosed guy describing his view of American government as being deep state dominated, and there's no doubt a lot of truth to that. So we have to keep our seatbelts on. But I'm telling you, if European leaders would speak out and tell the truth and tell what they know in private, it would make a world of difference.
Thank you very much. Ok, da switcher vi til norsk, og jeg fortsetter med